Welcome to Past Paradise, where Hollywood's golden age isn't just a memory, it's a world of untold secrets. Today we dive into the life of America's beloved leading man, Jimmy Stewart. Famous for his roles in classics like It's a Wonderful Life, Stewart's on-screen charm made him a household name. But behind the scenes, things weren't always picture-perfect. Stewart shocked the world when he called off his wedding to singer-actress Dinah at the very last moment. What drove the decision from the man who seemed to have it all? Let's unravel the twists and turns of Stewart's personal life. From heartbreak to Hollywood icon, stay tuned as we explore the surprising truths behind the legend. Boy of the American Dream. Jimmy Stewart grew up in a very typical American way. Stewart was born James Maitland Stewart in Pennsylvania. His father ran a hardware shop in the neighborhood, and his mother was an excellent piano player. Little Jimmy didn't want to be in front of a crowd initially. He'd instead do nothing but build model airplanes in the basement. But as is often the case, you must watch out for the quiet ones. People would learn more about him over time, but as the saying goes, good things take time. Leave well enough alone. Everyone knew him as an actor. However, many of the best people want to keep their private lives secret. The public rarely saw his private emotions, and he was said not to have many close friends. But the ones he did have all said nice things about him and helped him keep his privacy. You don't get to know Jimmy Stewart gets to know you, director John Ford once said of the man. He would not have liked how connected we are all the time now. We can be sure that Jimmy Stewart did not have a Twitter account. A hero at heart. Stewart was an American in his heart, and he always did what was right when the time came. Stewart wasn't the only Hollywood actor to join the U.S. Army during World War II. He was the first. His military career was quite enjoyable, which we'll talk about later. But his brave action motivated many others to give their lives to protect the world from Adolf Hitler and the Axis powers' unimaginable evil. He was the good guy in real life as well as on TV. Wow, what a guy! Believer in daydreams. Going back to his childhood, when he was young, Jimmy Stewart's mind was known to roam. The adults around him called him an uncontrollable daydreamer. Because of this, he was never really a straight-A student and usually got grades that were just good enough. They still liked him, though, especially his teachers and other adults in charge who dealt with him. They talked about how smooth and nice he was. Some people who thought they were Nostradamus even said his bad grades were because he spent too much time on his artistic side. They would be so right, though. A mostly single man. Jimmy Stewart didn't get married until he was 40, even though he was liked by many Americans and many women's dream guy. Many things could have caused it, and we'll discuss some soon. But the most fundamental reason might be that he liked being single. Hedda Hopper, a gossip writer, once called Stewart the Great American Bachelor. She said he was always looking for a date. With movie star money and a famous face, how could he be? But finding the right woman to marry took him a long time. There's no need to judge. Everyone has to sow wild oats. And Stewart was probably shy and had trouble letting people in. James, play us a tune. He was good at making himself look good on screen, but that wasn't all he could do. Everyone agreed that Jimmy Stewart could play the accordion very well. As if that fact alone wasn't enough to make you love how folksy it is, wait until you hear about how it all came about. Someone couldn't pay for what they bought one day at his dad's hardware shop. The man made an offer. He would trade his flute for money. His dad wasn't interested in it, so he gave it to his son. Then the neighborhood barber sat down with young Jimmy and showed him how to play it. This sounds like something made up for a cheesy movie that might or might not have starred Jimmy Stewart. Do any of you feel like Norman Rockwell? Yes, we are. A man from the Ivy League. When Stewart was a kid, his dream was to become a pilot. He was always the kid with his head in the clouds. He did want his son to go to school, though, and get a good education. Princeton University was calling. Stewart, being a good kid, went to school and started getting a degree in design in 1928. He got a degree that he would never use in the long run, but could still pursue his interests. Stewart's thesis was about airport design, so even though he was temporarily stuck in a field he wasn't going to stay in for the long term, he could still show the dreamer in him. This is Fonda. Everybody needs a best friend, and Stewart's was Henry Fonda. They were both still in college when they met, and they quickly became best friends. Still, they were humble students then and had no idea the world planned for them to live like stars. They became great friends while living together and would stay friends for life. The classic Hollywood bromance, which was quiet. How many of us know someone who meets their best friend in college and then goes on to become famous with them in their chosen field? That's not many for sure. Behind enemy lines. We said we'd talk more about Stewart's time in the military, and now we are. While it was pretty standard for famous people to join the Army to show support for the American GI, most of them only did so as symbolic work and didn't fight. On the other hand, Stewart wouldn't sit on the bench and insisted on being in the middle of the action. He didn't see why people should treat him differently just because he'd been in a few movies. Again, Stewart's love of planes came into play, and he learned how to fly. As soon as he got his wings, he begged to go on dangerous missions. A lot of people were upset by this, but this man wouldn't stop. He joined as a private and quickly worked his way up to colonel in just 4 years. He fought in Germany in areas with a lot of fighting and was given the important Croix de Guerre when he left the Army. Ladies' man. It's been said before that everyone loved and knew him, most of all women. It makes sense. He was one of the biggest stars of his time. Jimmy Stewart always had someone to go on a trip and have fun with. Ginger Rogers, Loretta Young, and other stars all had flings with the man, some of which were very intense and could have turned very serious. But none of them ever worked out. Young chose her backup man over Stewart in the end. Even though this was a rough hit, she wasn't exactly wrong. The cute Stewart didn't seem like he would ever be tied down by one woman at the time. The kid stays in the picture. Stewart went on to become one of the biggest and most bankable stars of his time. But MGM didn't really believe in him as an actor at first. The studio hired him, but they thought of him more as a silly, awkward freak than as the main man he would become. It's said that an executive who didn't think things through called the young actor a lanky young bumpkin with a hesitant manner of speech. All of that's true, but what they didn't know was that people would love that about him. At that time, most great guys fit into a very small box. They were haughty, well-dressed, and above and beyond what a guy should be. Stewart wasn't like other people. He cared about people. He seemed like he was part of the group. People loved him because they could see themselves in him. Funny movies. Jimmy Stewart was known for being very skinny for most of his life. A lot of people would be jealous of that, but it got him into trouble more than once. But because he was so short, he was put on the third-string football team in high school. The coach probably thought that if they hit the kid too hard, they'd break him in half. That wasn't the only time his weight, or lack of it, would hurt him. The first time he tried to join the U.S. Army, he was turned down because he was 5 pounds too thin. In order to make the bare minimum, the poor guy had to run home and stuff his face for several days. The fact that he would do this for his country shows how dedicated and kind he is. It's possible that Christian Bale heard this story when he was just starting out as an actor and it inspired him. A nice, classic love story. As was already said, Jimmy Stewart didn't get married and settle down until he was middle-aged. Some lucky turns of events could have made all of that happen much sooner, but alas, they did not. I know you've choked up already. Grab some popcorn. Stewart had a crush on actor Margaret Sullivan. He liked her right away when they met in college. He tried hard to win her love, but fate had other plans and she never returned the favor. But she liked him a lot and they became very close friends. Given who she married in the end, that's pretty amazing. Stewart's agent, and they got married in 1936. He may have been single for a long time because of his broken heart. Jack, meet Frank. Stewart's early career was mostly made up of small parts, but he did good work and had a hard time getting a big break. He seemed like he might only be good at that for a short time until Mr. Frank Capra showed up. Before, Capra spent a lot of time with Clark Gable, who was his creative inspiration. But when he wanted to switch things up, Stewart became his man Friday. He was in You Can't Take It With You because Capra hired him. Capra loved his work, and the two of them worked together happily for a long time. They worked together on Mr. Smith Goes to Washington and It's a Wonderful Life, which are both thought to be two of Stewart's best movies. Friends are the most important. The Philadelphia Story is the movie that won Stewart his Oscar, which is the highest honor for actors. In the movie, he was in it with Katharine Hepburn and Cary Grant. He won the coveted gold statue at the 1941 Academy Awards. He must have had the best night of his professional life, the happiest night of his life. Well, it probably was, but there's one big problem with the story. Stewart and his longtime friend, Henry Fonda, had both been nominated. Stewart, who's always willing to help others, had actually voted for Fonda. A man with honors. Didn't we say there was more to say about the man's time in the military? Okay, here it is. Jimmy Stewart not only became a colonel in the U.S. Army, but he also rose to the more prestigious rank of brigadier general. This is a big deal, even for Army leaders, let alone an actor who's also a fighter. Indeed, Stewart is still the most senior actor in American history who served in the military. When you see Jimmy Stewart in a movie, remember to stand up and respect. That man is better than you. Oh no, Mr. Bailey! The movie It's a Wonderful Life is always shown at Christmas. It'd be hard to miss during the holidays as it plays on many stations. It's made millions of people happy and sparked a huge number of versions, fakes, and copies. However, even though we know it as a happy story, it must have been a nightmare to work on. Stewart had just come back to the United States from the war and seemed stressed the whole time. He may have been upset because he didn't know if his job would continue to go well now that he was back. We'll talk more about that later. Donna Reed, who worked with him, said, "This is not a happy set." James and Edgar. In his work life, Jimmy Stewart was without a doubt seen as one of the nicest and most upbeat actors ever. But in his personal life, he had hobbies that were the opposite of that. How big are these? The fact that he loved Edgar Allan Poe's writing. Poe was known for writing scary and strange stories, so it's hard to imagine individuals like George Bailey coming home from a day of being a fun and friendly scamp to read his work. Coming back to the Thin Man. Stewart was always shy about talking about what he did in the war. This makes a lot of sense, and many guys who went through the horrible things it caused have felt the same way. But it did have effects on him, both mentally and in this case, physically. Following the war, Stewart's food intake dropped even more. He'd never really been a competitive eater. He wouldn't eat much some days. Someone who wrote about the actor says that he would often go for long periods of time eating only peanut butter and ice cream. Not exactly the normal way to lose weight. How strong the friend zone is. We already talked about how Margaret Sullivan broke Stewart's heart when she married his agent instead of him. Anyway, they were always the best of friends and worked together perfectly. She helped him come out of his shell and show the world what kind of a person he was. Stewart had a rough start as an actor and felt bad about himself a lot of the time. Executives were wary of investing in him because he didn't have much confidence in himself. She talked to studio heads about getting him roles in movies, and it was in her contracts that he had to be in movies with her. She also helped him control his drawl and other habits as a part-time performance coach. It was Margaret Sullivan who made James Stewart a star, director Edward Griffith once said. The nicest guy in town. It's a Wonderful Life wasn't always the beloved holiday hit it is now. It was just another movie looking for its main man. Frank Capra was looking for someone to play George Bailey, and for a while both Stewart and his friend Henry Fonda were in the running. Seems clear now, but that's only because we can see it so clearly now. Casting is a hard process for everyone. Capra finally agreed that there was only one person who could do the job, a man who's almost always positive and good, like the character. In the end, Capra said, "I knew one man who could play it, James Stewart." To be honest, my dear, Stewart had a number of well-known relationships, but he was single for a long time. His relationship with Olivia de Havilland may have been the most well-known of them all. After being together for a long time, it looked like things were going to get really serious when Stewart made his move and asked her to marry him. But it wasn't meant to be. Stewart felt like this story happened all too often. She turned him down. They broke up not long after, and de Havilland ended up living with director John Huston. Not going to the chapel. Some of Stewart's ex-girlfriends might have been worried about the idea of getting married to this guy. Even though he was attractive and likable, he'd broken up with women before. In 1942, Stewart was seen with actress Dinah Shore. They were engaged and everything was set for a white wedding and a happy ending. That didn't happen though, as you may have guessed. Stewart changed his mind before they got to the church in Las Vegas where the wedding was supposed to take place. The whole thing was called off indefinitely. The only actor who exists. Some people think that private people are not emotional, but the truth is that most of the time it's the opposite. Close friends of Stewart said that he was a very emotional person, especially when he was working. Kim Novak, who played his co-star in Vertigo, said that Stewart would often stay in an emotional state after the cut was called when he'd just finished an emotional scene. There were times when it took him a long time to get back to normal and get rid of the bad feeling. He goes to Washington, D.C. It's hard to understand why everyone loved Jimmy Stewart so much. In many ways, he was like Tom Hanks back then. Even President Harry S. Truman liked him a lot. He was heard saying, "If my wife and I had a son, we'd want him to be just like Jimmy Stewart." That's some pretty high praise from the leader of the free world. Try getting that kind of praise these days, or better yet, don't. In fact, let's not even talk about the leaders of today. What the hair says. Without a doubt, Stewart was good-looking, but his hair was a bit of a problem. He didn't have as much of it as he wanted. During his time in the military abroad, his hairline began to thin out. It was becoming more and more clear when he came back. He was lucky that he worked in the movie business where there's a department for that. If you've seen Stewart on TV or in movies, he almost certainly wore a toupee. At some point, it became important for him to keep up his on-screen look. Getting the bronze. The American Film Institute, or AFI, made a list of the best American male actors of all time in 1999, as if we needed more proof that Jimmy Stewart was a real star. There are many good horses in the race, so it'll be tough. On the other hand, Mr. Stewart did himself proud again. He came in third place in the end. He did pretty well, coming in ahead of stars like Marlon Brando, Spencer Tracy, and even his friend, Henry Fonda. Cary Grant and Humphrey Bogart were the two stars who beat him. The first impression. We already talked about Stewart's relationship problems, but as we said, he did end up happily married in the end. He fell in love with model Gloria Hatrick and married her in 1947. They got married in 1949 and lived happily for the rest of their lives. But because of how stupid he was, it could never have happened. The man had just crashed the party she was at the first time she met him. He was apparently very, very drunk and made a total fool out of himself. Patrick's honest about the fact that he didn't really win her over the first time. Eventually, though, they came to their senses and became friends. The rest of the story is very happy. A touch of smarts. We already said that Stewart was very private, but people feel free to force themselves on you because you're a movie star, whether it's nice, right, or neither. Fans from Pennsylvania set up in his front yard one day to try to get a look at the megastar. They were dying to meet the state's favorite son. Stewart wasn't happy, but he had to keep up his good name. The way he got rid of them was almost clever, but not too condescending. Pretty much what they asked for, he gave them. For a moment, he left his house to take a look at them. Then he turned on his water system without saying a word, getting the unwanted visitors wet. Everyone learned a lesson when he went back inside. After they left, his good nature was not called into question. Do not hold your cheers. Everyone has always had nice things to say about Jimmy. That being said, this has to be the most encouraging praise ever. For all of his work in movies over the years, Jimmy Stewart was given a special Oscar in 1985. Not only that, but the cheers were so loud that when he went to the stage to accept it, the show went on too long because of the 10-minute standing ovation. I know the Oscars never start on time, but the story's better if you don't think about that. His answer was also very moving. He was honest and said, "This was the best award I ever got. To know that after all these years, you still remember me." Always pure heart. Off-screen magic. The magic Stewart brought to movies was what he was most famous for. But before movies, he helped make a whole different kind of magic. From a poor family, things were never easy, so he had to work extra jobs to make extra money. Because it wasn't always easy to find work, he took it where he could. Being a helper to a magician was one of those jobs. Jimmy, who was young at the time, did all the behind-the-scenes work for a neighborhood magician. Without a doubt, it's a great job for the weekend. He might have been so captivating to watch because of this job. We're sorry about that joke. Don't worry about that one. Then Alfred showed up. Stewart's roles in Alfred Hitchcock's great movies, Rear Window and Vertigo, helped make movie history. For a while, they were having a good time. Then Hitchcock delivered one of his infamous low blows. Vertigo is now seen as a major achievement in film, but at the time it was laughed at by critics and not taken seriously by the public. It got bad reviews and didn't make enough money. Hitchcock said that Stewart was to blame for the movie's failure because he looked too old and wasn't interesting to watch, a charge that's clearly not true if you see the movie. But that's not all. Part 2 of And Then Came Alfred is now available. Remember how we said Hitchcock could be a jerk? It didn't end with the mean things he said in the deals. Stewart kept getting hit by those blows from Hitchcock. He needed a main man for North by Northwest, which he was about to start making. Stewart was definitely in the running at first, and he'd been excited to work with the British director again until lately. Not old Alfie, though. He turned his back on him. He chose Cary Grant, who looked younger, to play the lead role. And Stewart was left holding his hat. In a strange twist, Grant was 4 years older than Stewart, and still is. Until the end of time. In the beginning of his life, Stewart was the best playboy and single man in the world. Later, he'd become a wonderful husband. They stayed together for the rest of their lives after they got married. Even though we know that being married wasn't always great, that does say something. Love comes to different people in different ways. Some people find it quickly and easily, while others have a hard time for some reason. It doesn't matter. As long as you give and receive good love, the rest is just noise. I see, Pilgrim. Following World War II, Jimmy Stewart's no longer young but still charming charms found a somewhat shocking new home in Westerns. This interesting story is hidden in one of those shots. In John Ford's The Man Who Shot Liberty Valance, he played opposite the controversial but famous John Wayne. Many people now think of this movie as a classic and one of the best of its kind. It's also one of Stewart's best works. From what I've heard, though, things were tense on that set. At that time, John Ford, the director, wasn't a big fan of John Wayne. He didn't agree with the fact that Wayne had famously avoided the war and escaped being drafted. Ford was known to say things like, "How rich did you get while Jimmy was putting his life at risk?" Stewart, on the other hand, did something different. Reports say he tried his best to calm things down and never said anything bad about his co-star in public. He always said nice things about him. What a guy. Daddy trouble, but not that kind. When Stewart got his Oscar for the Philadelphia Story, he may have done the most Jimmy Stewart-like thing possible. That's why he gave it to his dad to show off in the family hardware shop. The problem was that his father, who wasn't very artsy, didn't really understand what was going on. His old man was asked, "I hear you won some kind of award," when Jimmy told him the news. "Is it a sign or something?" Dads are just dads sometimes, you know? How a poet feels. Stewart was very good at many things when he had time off, not just playing the accordion. Besides that, he was a great artist. One of the best things he ever wrote was probably an ode to his beloved dog who had died. Bo was the name of both the song and the dog. Even though Stewart isn't known for reading poetry, the time he did it live on an episode of The Tonight Show in 1981 may have been one of his best moments ever. At the end, both Stewart and Johnny Carson were crying out loud. A look at war. But Jimmy Stewart did have strong feelings about how Hollywood makes war movies, even though he rarely talked about his time on the front lines. From what everyone said, he didn't like them at all. He was quoted many times as saying they were wrong. They were Stewart's main source of income, but he only appeared in 2 of them during his whole career. The head of MGM, Louis B. Mayer, once offered that they make a war movie about him and his work in the war. He came up with the title The Jimmy Stewart Story, but the actor said no right away. Breakups in the family. Stewart taught his kids to be proud to be Americans and fighters, just like he was. He expected them to join the army and serve the country, too. The way people felt was good, but it cost Stewart something he never could have imagined. Sad to say, his oldest son Ronald was killed in Vietnam in 1969 while on active duty. We love to honor war heroes, but we'll always remember what it did to people. Stewart thought about this loss all his days. Some nice words. Henry Fonda died in 1982, which was sad for everyone in the movie business, but especially for Jimmy Stewart. Both had been working as artists their whole lives and had known each other for a long time. They'd grown up together, been green together, and done well together. In typical fashion, he didn't show much feeling in public and instead decided to cry alone. He did, however, say one thing in public, and it was both heartbreaking and beautiful in how short it was. "I just lost my best friend," was all he said. Success as a child. It was only 32 years ago that Stewart won the Oscar for Best Actor for his role in the Philadelphia Story. In today's world, that might not seem very impressive, but at the time he was the youngest male actor to ever win the award. Most of the time, artists would be around 40 years old when they even got close to the gold medal. This record stood out for a whole 14 years until Marlon Brando, an up-and-coming actor who was 30 years old at the time, won an Oscar for his famous part on the waterfront. Going to see Gloria. Things that are good always end, even a love as real as the one between Stewart and his wife Gloria. When she died in 1994, the actor was understandably devastated. Close friends said he was lost at sea, and he died himself 3 years later at the beautiful age of 89. His thoughts were with his wife even in the very end. "I'm going to be with Gloria now," were said to be his last words to the world. An eternal goodbye from the heart. Jimmy Stewart passed away on July 2, 1997 from heart failure. He was 89 years old. Everyone was sad to lose someone as special as Stewart, but the love that came out from him in the last moments and afterward was amazing. His family and friends were all around him. He was grieved by everyone in the country he loved, had worked for, and had put his life on the line for. People heard President Bill Clinton say that the U.S. was losing a national treasure, and that he was a great actor, a gentleman, and a patriot. No one has ever said such true words before or since. The bad side. Everybody thought he was the best, and in many ways they were right. Jimmy Stewart was not a perfect guy, though. In fact, he did some very bad things every once in a while. In 1939, he had an affair with Marlene Dietrich, one of his co-stars, who was married at the time. They met while making Destry Rides Again, and things kept going from there. Then another. It's not really a Boy Scout thing to do. Some stories say the water was even darker and deeper than that. Even though it's just a rumor, it's worth listening to. 2 or 3 folks say that Dietrich was pregnant. To save her job, and by extension Stewart's, she had it aborted. After they were done shooting the movie, Stewart quickly broke up with her. Everybody has a bad side. War will always be there. People say that Stewart's service in World War II hurt him deeply and will last a long time. People have been through war before, so this story isn't new, but it hits close to home. People say he was never quite the same after he came back. Everyone knew him as the nice guy from the movies, but there was something that would always be there on his mind. PTSD, with signs like fear and shaking, is said to have affected him by different sources. He had also lost some hearing because of the loud gunshots, engine noise, and cannon fire. People who knew him said that he looked different too. People who heard him said his parents were shocked at how thin he had become. He was probably 10 years older now than he was before the war.